In a high-stakes congressional showdown seen by millions, Jasmine Crockett steps into the spotlight with a stack of documents and a mission to expose the truth that Linda McMahon handed millions to allies, while real small businesses were left to die. Across from her sits McMahon, calm, powerful, and unprepared for what's coming. Within minutes, the atmosphere shifts as Crockett reveals shocking numbers, hidden connections, and a trail of favoritism buried beneath years of polished politics. Tension explodes, reputations hang by a thread, and silence grips the room. What hidden truth turned this hearing into a national reckoning over corruption, privilege, and the price of power? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The air inside the Rayburn House office building was razor-sharp with anticipation. Journalists filled every corner of the gallery, cameras poised like loaded weapons, their red lights blinking in silent readiness. In the center of the hearing room, the mahogany witness table gleamed beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, and at its edge sat Linda McMahon, shoulders back, jaw set, expression unmoved. She wore her legacy like armor. Former Chief Executive Officer of World Wrestling Entertainment, former Administrator of the Small Business Administration, and a woman accustomed to controlling the narrative. Dressed in an immaculately tailored cream blazer, she exuded practiced confidence, nodding politely at committee members, her smile a calculated blend of politeness and superiority. She had weathered scandals before and survived political storms with minimal damage. To her, this was just another hearing, a procedural formality, a stage she believed she owned. But then the door swung open. In stepped Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't there to play the supporting role. No camera flash could outshine the storm in her stride, nor the fury burning beneath her composed expression. Clad in midnight blue, her eyes locked forward with surgical focus, carrying a slim leather folder that might as well have been a weapon. This wasn't just about policy, it was about justice. As she took her seat behind the elevated committee bench, the room shifted. The buzz dulled. Linda McMahon glanced up just briefly and caught the look in Jasmine Crockett's eyes. Cold calculation wrapped in moral fire. Crockett had not come to speak softly or seek civility. She had come to expose something rotten, something buried deep beneath polished press releases and inflated resumes. And no amount of corporate bravado could prepare McMahon for the reckoning walking toward her. One click of the microphone, one sentence away. And then it began. Not with fire, but with frost. Linda McMahon, seated upright behind the witness table, shifted ever so slightly in her chair as the committee chair yielded the floor to Representative Jasmine Crockett. The older woman adjusted her lapel, folded her hands with ceremony, and spoke as though reading from a script she had written herself. One where she played the seasoned architect of industry, and Crockett was merely an ambitious understudy. "Congresswoman," she began, her tone perfectly polished, carefully dipped in the civility, but forged in steel. "I appreciate your passion for these issues truly, but I do hope you understand that operating a small legal consultancy, even a successful one, is quite different from navigating the vast complexities of our national small business infrastructure." The words came slowly, deliberately, as though she wanted each syllable to carry weight. "When I ran World Wrestling Entertainment, I wasn't just managing clients. I was managing global strategy, job creation, international expansion, and innovation at scale. We weren't theorizing. We were executing." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. McMahon's voice remained soft, but every note carried a veiled slap. "You see, I have signed the front of paychecks, not just the back. I have sat at tables where real economic risks were weighed, not hypotheticals. That's not something you learn in law school. It's something you earn through decades in the trenches." She gave a short, restrained laugh, more air than sound, as if to signal to the committee that the point had been made, and that anything that followed from Crockett could only be interpreted as naive rebuttal. A few Republican representatives on the panel nodded, almost imperceptibly, a quiet signal of alignment. On the sidelines, cameras zoomed in, trying to catch a twitch of Crockett's lip, a flicker of discomfort, something, anything, to confirm McMahon's subtle dominance. But there was none. Only silence, thick and reverberating. And in that silence, something shifted. Not in the air, but in the moral weight of the room. Because what Linda McMahon didn't know, or perhaps refused to know, was that the woman sitting across from her had been discounted before. Not once, not twice, but hundreds of times. She had been spoken to in that same tone on court benches, in back rooms, in press conferences, by men in expensive suits and women with impressive resumes who saw only the surface. To them, Jasmine Crockett was just another young activist, another black woman with too much emotion and too little experience. But behind Crockett's steady breath was a mountain of lived knowledge. Behind her unread expression was the voice of every small business owner in her district who was told politely and systematically that they didn't qualify, that they didn't belong, that someone else was more appropriate. And now here in this room it was happening again, but this time not quietly. The injustice wasn't just in the words McMahon used, it was in the ease with which she dismissed a fellow public servant as unworthy of standing across from her. The implication that business expertise came only from corporate pedigree and not from the lived struggle of trying to keep neighborhood shops alive through broken systems and empty promises. It was the same old arrogance wearing a new face. But what McMahon failed to see was that she hadn't just insulted Crockett. She had ignited her, and the reckoning had only just begun. But McMahon's smile hadn't even finished forming before Crockett moved. Quietly, decisively, like someone who had been waiting for this exact moment her entire life. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She simply reached into the slim leather folder before her and withdrew a single sheet of paper, holding it between her fingers like a blade. "Let's deal in facts now," Crockett said, her tone even and controlled, but laced with something undeniable. Truth. She placed the paper gently on the table, face up, the seal of the Office of Inspector General clearly visible at the top. "This audit," she continued, "was conducted internally but never released to the public. My office obtained it through a Freedom of Information Act request. It reviews the small business grant program during your time as administrator, and it reveals something deeply troubling." She paused, letting the room absorb the gravity of her words. "According to this official review, nearly 43% of the grants distributed during your leadership went to companies that failed to meet your own eligibility requirements, companies that were too large, too rich, or too politically connected." The silence in the room thickened like smoke. Crockett's hands remained steady as she pulled out a second document, this one covered in yellow highlights and bold red annotations. She read aloud with clinical precision, naming companies that had received hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, in federal funding, despite employing far more than the 50-employee cap or earning well above the $5 million revenue threshold. Titanium Technologies, Nova Healthcare Solutions, Retech Manufacturing Group, she listed, eyes never leaving McMahon. One of them had 215 employees. Another had annual revenues of $28 million. None of them qualified. All of them received grants. She turned a page. And what do these companies have in common? Their executives donated to your political action committees. One served on your nonprofit's advisory board. Another was previously employed by your husband's entertainment company. This isn't coincidence, Mrs. McMahon. It's a pattern of doors opening quietly for those closest to you, while small, honest businesses in underserved communities were left behind. Crockett leaned back slightly, but her voice dropped. More personal now, more pointed. "I represent business owners who work 18 hours a day just to keep their lights on. Mothers running beauty salons out of their kitchens. Veterans trying to reopen cafes that shut down during the pandemic. They followed the rules. They applied. And they were denied. But your friends? Your allies? They walk through a side door none of us even knew existed." Her final sentence fell like stone. This wasn't just bad management. It was betrayal of the people this program was supposed to serve. But McMahon wasn't finished, at least not in her own mind. The sting of Crockett's accusations had sliced deep, but the former administrator straightened her back, clasped her hands together, and leaned into the microphone with the steady voice of someone who had survived far worse storms, at least in her own estimation. "Congresswoman," she began with practiced calm, "I understand your concerns, But in any nationwide program of this scale, there are always circumstances that fall outside the standard mold. Exceptions are not evidence of wrongdoing. They are tools of adaptation. Some of these businesses may not have fit the technical criteria, yes, but they served sectors in economic crisis. They were anchors in distressed communities, job creators in rural zones, innovators in emerging technologies. Our discretion allowed us to be responsive, not rigid. These weren't handouts for the well-connected. They were strategic choices made in real time to keep the economy from collapsing. For a moment she paused, as if her answer were both irrefutable and benevolent, as if the weight of her justification could somehow smother the evidence Crockett had already laid bare. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She let the words settle like dust, and then cleared them from the air with one cold, decisive breath. Reaching into the binder before her, thick, tabbed, meticulously organized, she flipped to a section labeled Disparity Zones, Denial Rates. Her tone remained composed, but the edge in it had returned, honed now not by emotion, but by righteous precision. "Let's examine this idea of exceptions, Mrs. McMahon," she said, holding up a chart filled with numbers in black and red. "In Texas District 30, which I represent, 96% of qualified applicants were denied funding. These weren't companies seeking flexibility. These were nail salons, mom-and-pop hardware stores, minority-owned landscaping businesses, and community daycare centers, every one of them meeting the written criteria. But they were denied, not once, not twice, systematically." She turned another page, revealing side-by-side approval maps, one saturated in red for urban centers like hers, another awash in green for wealthier, suburban zones. And yet, companies like Fairmont Synergy, a firm with over 160 employees and $17 million in annual revenue, received full grant funding in under 14 days. They weren't in a distressed sector. They weren't in a rural zone. But their chief executive officer donated to 3 political campaigns you were affiliated with. Her voice dropped slightly, slower, like the tightening of a vice. Another recipient, Kinvara Diagnostics, received $900,000 while operating in a profitable biotech corridor and employing more than 100 staff. Their lead legal counsel once served on your advisory board. Tell me, Mrs. McMahon, how exactly do those qualify as distressed? The tension in the room thickened like fog. Crockett took a breath, not to collect herself, but to allow the weight of the silence to settle. You say exceptions are tools, but tools in whose hands, used for whose benefit? Because from where I sit, they were used not to lift up the vulnerable, but to excuse the elevation of the connected. The result wasn't flexibility, it was disparity. She leaned forward now, her eyes narrowing slightly, not with rage, but with an unbearable clarity. You call this adaptation, but I call it what my community felt every time they walked into a shuttered storefront. Abandonment masked as strategy. And no polished press release will change that. And just when the illusion of exceptions seemed to teeter on the edge of collapse, Jasmine Crockett tore it down, piece by piece, name by name, dollar by dollar. She turned another tab in her binder, red labeled and thick with attached documentation. Her fingers moved slowly now, deliberately, like someone about to detonate something that could not be undone. "Let's stop the theoretical, Mrs. McMahon," she said, her voice low but caring. "Let's discuss titanium technologies." She lifted a grant award approval sheet from the pile and held it in the air, the ink still crisp beneath the white light of the overheads. This company received $1.2 million through the Premier Business Grant Program in 2019. The same program that you insisted had been managed fairly and within eligibility guidelines. She stepped back from her seat and walked to the center podium, eyes locked on McMahon. At the time of their application, Titanium Technologies had 215 employees. Not 49, not even 100, 215. And their revenue? Over $28 million. More than 5 times the legal limit set for grant eligibility. A long pause. Crockett let the silence stretch like a blade drawn across the room. But it wasn't the numbers that made the room shift. It was what came next. "The chief executive officer of Titanium Technologies," she continued, "is Robert Williamson. That name may sound familiar to you, Mrs. McMahon, because Mr. Williamson was a maxed-out donor to not one, but two of your affiliated political committees during the 2018 cycle. Gasps didn't erupt, but they pulsed beneath the surface. He also served quietly, unlisted in public briefings, on the advisory board of your family's nonprofit, where he contributed strategic insight during your time at the Small Business Administration. Crockett placed the documents face up on the table, slid them toward the committee, then met McMahon's eyes with unwavering calm. That's not discretion. That's not economic triage. That's political access turned into public dollars. The energy in the chamber constricted. McMahon's jaw tightened. Her hands, previously folded in calm control, began to shift slightly, one thumb pressing against the other in small, visible circles. And Crockett wasn't done. Not even close. She turned another page. Nova Healthcare Solutions, she announced with the force of a prosecutor entering final evidence, awarded $800,000 in federal funds. At the time, 178 employees, gross revenue just under $19 million, both metrics far beyond the limit. But perhaps most relevant of all, their executive chairman was a former vice president at World Wrestling Entertainment. Your company, during your leadership. The camera lenses in the room focused now not on the speaker, but the subject. He later served as a strategic transition advisor to your office at the Small Business Administration, not because he was qualified in federal policy, but because he was loyal. Crockett took a breath, not out of exhaustion, but calculation. This is not an isolated slip, she said, her voice deepening. This is a pattern of doors opening in silence, behind closed meetings, for men in suits who already had options. While first-generation shopkeepers in my district, who filed every form, met every rule, passed every inspection, were told there's just not enough funding left. Her voice turned sharp as flint. But there was funding. It just never made it to them, because it was already spoken for. The silence following Crockett's last revelation was not empty. It was suffocating. You could hear the shifting of paper, the strained breaths of aides, the low mechanical whir of camera lenses zooming in. But McMahon had no more silence left to hide in. She leaned forward, her polished demeanor cracking not in volume, but in desperation. I can't speak to every individual case, she began, her voice unsteady but still clinging to the illusion of control. There are nuances to each grant. There were teams, review panels, compliance officers, discretionary authorities. These decisions weren't made in a vacuum. We had to consider a wide range of criteria. It's never black and white. But the words, vague, procedural, evasive, hung in the air like smoke from a fire already out of control. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her restraint was more terrifying than anger. Mrs. McMahon, she said, slow and deliberate, if what you're describing is a system of checks and balances, then I'd like you to explain why that system kept checking in favor of your friends. She reached into her folder and pulled a packet of printouts, emails, internal memos, staff notes, all neatly collated. March 18th, 2019, she said, flipping to the top page, holding it up with surgical precision. An internal email chain between you and your former advisor, Thomas Kelly. Subject line, priority list. Your instruction, direct quote, these applications should be pushed forward. We need some fast wins with this group. She paused, letting that line bleed into the room. Now let me be clear, she continued, voice lower, steadier. Every single company on that list received funding within 30 days. Most of them exceeded employee or revenue limits, and not one came from a distressed area or qualified as minority-owned or woman-owned. But nearly all had one thing in common. They had financial or personal ties to you. The committee chambers shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Members who had been casually observing now leaned forward. Staffers began whispering behind raised hands. McMahon's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles pale against the wood. But Crockett didn't relent. She flipped the page again. Titanium Technologies, Kinvara Diagnostics, Hartley Innovations. I could go on. These weren't decisions made in the dark by some faceless bureaucracy. These were choices, your choices, And every time you chose a company with access, a company in my district lost its shot. Her voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow louder than any shout. This isn't administrative oversight. This is systemic betrayal. And as Crockett's final line settled into the charged stillness of the room, this is systemic betrayal. A subtle but irreversible unraveling began behind the witness table. Linda McMahon sat motionless for half a second too long, her face once unreadable behind the perfected sheen of public service and corporate polish, began to betray what words no longer could shield. A slight tremor crept into her right hand as it hovered above the water glass, then retreated. She tried again, but this time the glass clinked lightly against the table's surface, the sound startling in the silence. Her fingers gripped it tightly, not to drink, but to anchor herself against the spinning gravity of the moment. The pages in front of her, once prepared as shields of defense, now looked like foreign language. The print swam. She blinked rapidly, then reached for the top page as if rereading it might change its meaning. It didn't. The damning email, the donor-linked approvals, the numbers she'd never expected to see recited in public, let alone sewn together into a narrative she couldn't control. A thin sheen of sweat had begun to rise just above her brow. Her once confident posture slackened by inches. Her shoulders rolled forward as if bracing against a weight no one could lift. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her gaze flicked toward the committee chair, then to her counsel seated behind her, then to the cameras, red lights glowing like sirens that wouldn't stop. But no one came to her rescue. No interjection, no technical objection, no redirect. Just the weight of her own decisions, now crashing inward from every angle. Crockett hadn't raised her voice, hadn't moved from her seat, and yet McMahon sat as if the ceiling itself had begun to descend upon her. In that moment, every ounce of privilege, every polished line of resume, every room she'd once commanded, all of it cracked under the sheer, suffocating pressure of being seen without filter or frame. And there was no script left to follow. And as McMahon sat there, visibly unraveling under the weight of her own evasions, Crockett seized the silence, not to gloat, but to deliver something far more lethal: documented truth. Her movement was deliberate, almost reverent, as she reached into the final section of her binder and drew out a single sheet of paper encased in a plastic sleeve, its contents printed in clear, professional font. She held it in both hands like a judge preparing to read a verdict. "Mrs. McMahon," she said, her voice steady and cold, "you testified that all grant recipients were vetted thoroughly and that any deviations from eligibility criteria were handled through a rigorous review process." She paused, not for drama, but to give McMahon one last chance to brace. "Would you care to explain this email?" Crockett laid the document flat on the table in front of her. Dated March 18th, 2019. Sent from your official SBA email to your then senior advisor, Thomas Kelly. The subject line reads, "Priority Grant List." Her voice sharpened as she continued. The body of the message is short, direct, and unmistakable. You wrote, "These applications should be moved to the top of the pile. We need some fast wins with this group." She leaned forward slightly, never breaking eye contact. No reference to eligibility, no mention of audit protocols, just political urgency. And what's more damning, Mrs. McMahon, every single business listed in that email received grant approval. Every single one. Despite the fact that the majority did not meet the employee or revenue threshold defined in your own program. The tension in the room hardened into something almost physical. Crockett didn't blink. One of them, as previously noted, was Titanium Technologies, 215 employees, $28 million in revenue. Another, Kinvara Diagnostics, over 100 staff, $18.9 million in gross earnings. Not outliers, not exceptions, violations. Her voice, though calm, now cut like glass. And these weren't accidental oversights. These were handpicked, prioritized, directed. She tapped the document with two fingers. "By you." She allowed a beat of silence. And while these businesses, flush with political capital, were pushed to the front of the line, community businesses in my district, barbershops, diners, daycare centers, were being told they were denied, that the money had run out, that they were too late. She straightened her shoulders. But they weren't too late, were they, Mrs. McMahon? They were just never on your list. And after Crockett's final blow, delivered not with malice but with the calm devastation of truth, the weight of the moment bore down on McMahon like a slow, merciless collapse. She didn't speak at first. She couldn't. Her mouth opened slightly but no sound came. Her eyes flicked down to the document in front of her. The email, damning in its clarity, undeniable in its origin, and then darted briefly to the committee, to the rows of unspeaking lawmakers now watching her not as a former administrator, but as the subject of something unraveling. Her chest rose in shallow breaths, each one shorter than the last. When she finally found her voice, it came strangled, a rasp instead of a rebuttal. I don't recall sending that email in the context it's being interpreted," she muttered, her words colliding with each other. "There were many submissions. Thousands. The decisions weren't mine alone. But her defenses had lost their scaffolding. The polished diction, the calm cadence, gone. Replaced now with the halting, hesitant rhythm of someone trying to steady themselves in a crumbling tower of their own construction." Crockett said nothing. She didn't need to. McMahon's hands trembled visibly as she reached once more for the water glass, but her grip faltered. The glass clinked against the table, echoing far too loudly in the silence. She withdrew her hand and instead clenched it into a fist, knuckles pressing against the wood as if bracing for something physical. Her gaze dropped again to the pile of printed evidence that now sat like rubble before her. Emails, audits, charts, lists she never expected to see so publicly dissected. Her lips parted as if to try again, but then her face shifted, eyes widening slightly, the tension in her jaw giving way. A single tear welled, hung for a moment in the corner of her eye, and then fell, silently, without resistance, down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Not right away. Another followed, slower, trailing through the powder on her face, cutting a line that even the cameras couldn't ignore. And then, softly, so softly it barely registered as speech, she admitted what everyone in the room already knew. There were mistakes. Her voice cracked on the second word. There were decisions made that, looking back, I should have questioned. She blinked hard, the tears now steady, and her hand rose shakily to her face. I trusted people. I relied on processes that failed. And yes, I should have seen it. Her voice faded into a whisper. I should have stopped it. At that moment, the hearing room no longer held a figure of corporate might or political power, but a woman exposed and undone by a truth she could no longer reshape. And as the final syllables of McMahon's shaky admission faded into the stillness, I should have stopped it. Representative Jasmine Crockett did what few in that room anticipated. She did not press further. She did not capitalize on the collapse, did not exploit the tears now trailing through the last remnants of Linda McMahon's authority. Instead, with a steady inhale, she closed the folder in front of her and shifted the weight of the moment from exposure to action. Her voice, when it returned, was no longer honed for interrogation, but for rebuilding. Mrs. McMahon, she began, her tone calm yet unwavering. What we've uncovered here today is not just a series of administrative failures. It is evidence of a system so vulnerable to influence, so blind to equity, that it functionally abandoned the very people it was created to serve. Her hands remained folded, but her posture rose. And so, I will not leave this hearing today with just indignation. I will leave it with legislation. She reached into her case and withdrew a crisp document with a bold black header. The Small Business Equity Act. She laid it on the table in full view, not as a threat, but as a promise. This bill, she said, will mandate independent multi-reviewer panels for all federal grant decisions. No more single gatekeepers. No more shadow shortcuts. It will require public transparency dashboards, updated in real time, where any American can see who receives funding and why. It will guarantee that no less than 40% of grant allocations reach underserved districts, places like the one I represent, where people follow the rules but never see the returns. The room no longer buzzed with confrontation. It listened. It absorbed. Crockett's eyes never left McMahon's now fragile figure, But her voice spoke beyond her, to the nation, to the millions watching who had long felt invisible. We do not need more powerful people bending rules for their peers. We need structures that protect those without access, those who don't have lobbyists or personal connections or priority emails. This legislation is not about vengeance. It is about justice. Not the courtroom kind, but the kind that reaches barbershops, food trucks, and community health centers. The kind that makes systems serve everyone, not just the chosen few. Then, and only then, did she turn directly back to McMahon. I am asking you, not as a former executive, not as a partisan, but as someone who today witnessed what happens when truth is brought into the light, will you support these reforms? The question didn't explode. It resonated. It was not a trap. It was an offering. McMahon's lips parted. Her hands, now folded tightly in her lap, trembled faintly. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with a voice no longer clothed in power, she answered softly, I don't agree with everything, but I agree it's broken. Yes, I will support it. And in that moment, the hearing didn't erupt. It settled, like dust finally touching ground after a long, brutal collapse. Not with celebration, but with solemn clarity. The system had failed, but someone, finally, was trying to fix it. And as McMahon's fragile voice faded into silence, yes, I will support it. The hearing adjourned, but the storm had only just begun. What happened inside those chamber walls didn't stay contained. It broke free, unleashed by a single video clip that captured it all with surgical precision. Jasmine Crockett, standing tall, holding a government-stamped email aloft like a verdict, while across from her, Linda McMahon sat paralyzed, shoulders slumped, mascara streaked, the embodiment of collapse. That 43-second clip, posted first by a Hill staffer on X, formerly Twitter, ignited like dry tinder. Within 20 minutes, it had crossed 1 million views. Within the hour, it had appeared on homepages across the internet. The headline that rose to the top was short and brutal. She brought the receipts, and heir to a billion-dollar empire had nothing to say. But others were no less cutting. McMahon exposed for grant favoritism, breaks down under fire, read another. A reckoning at the SBA, Crockett turns the tables on power, became a trending topic across platforms. By late afternoon, news vans crowded the east entrance of the Capitol. Reporters scrambled for live shots, their voices hurried, urgent, as they recounted the most shocking moments. Crockett's forensic delivery of data, the unveiling of the March 18th email, McMahon's final tear-soaked admission. Cable networks cut into scheduled programming with special reports. CNN opened its 6 p.m. broadcast with the words, "We begin tonight with a political confrontation that is already being called historic." MSNBC called it a masterclass in accountability. Even conservative outlets, typically aligned with McMahon circles, struggled to spin the footage. The visual was too raw, too clear. A woman long considered untouchable, crumbling under the undeniable weight of documented truth. And it wasn't just the national media. Local news in cities across America led with Crockett's speech. In Dallas, a headline ran, "District 30 Representative Shocks Washington with SBA Takedown." In Detroit, minority-owned businesses were locked out. Now the country knows. What had begun as a routine oversight hearing had become something far greater, a flashpoint, a reckoning, a rare, unscripted collapse of power in real time. And in every corner of the digital world, from late-night commentary to policy podcasts, one question echoed louder than all others. If this is what was happening in plain sight, what else is hiding behind the curtain? And as the viral clip continued to dominate headlines and light up every screen in America, the public reaction quickly gave way to something deeper. Dissection, analysis, judgment not just of the moment, but of the method behind it. By dawn the next morning, the confrontation between Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Linda McMahon had already been replayed, reanalyzed, and reframed by nearly every major political network and media outlet in the country. Yet what emerged from the noise was not confusion, but rare consensus, across party lines, across ideological divides, across industries that usually share nothing but skepticism for one another. From the polished studio floors of CNN to the heated panels of Fox News, Crockett's handling of the hearing was being heralded as nothing short of a surgical display of governance done right. "What we saw wasn't a political ambush," said Fox News analyst Greg Harrow, his tone unusually reflective for a man often quick to dismiss progressives. "It was a lesson in what preparation looks like. No theatrics, no stunts, just unshakable facts delivered with the composure of someone who came not to posture, but to hold power accountable." Other voices joined in rapidly. Former Senator Claire McCaskill, speaking on MSNBC's Morning Joe, called Crockett's performance a prosecutorial masterpiece. "This wasn't just about exposing Linda McMahon," McCaskill said. "It was about tearing the curtain off an entire system of influence, favoritism, and quiet sabotage that hurts the very people federal aid is supposed to protect." Political strategist Ana Navarro posted a clip from the hearing alongside a single sentence. "Now that's how you cross-examine the system itself." And beyond the media class, something else was shifting, something heavier. By midday, statements began rolling in from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, a moderate Democrat from Virginia, released a public endorsement of the Small Business Equity Act, calling it a critical correction to a federal apparatus that has drifted too far from the communities it was designed to serve. Even more surprising was a measured but clear signal of support from Republican Senator Todd Young, who told reporters outside the Capitol, "Transparency and multi-layered review aren't partisan ideas. They're constitutional safeguards." What we saw in that hearing was not just a problem, it was a pattern, and patterns demand reform. The resonance wasn't limited to Capitol Hill. Across the business world, major voices from small business coalitions and economic equity foundations began echoing the same sentiment. Crockett's revelations didn't just target one administrator, they exposed a systemic rot. Renee Bautista, CEO of the Coalition for Equitable Capital Access, went live on LinkedIn within hours of the hearing and addressed her network of 200,000 small business owners and investors. "This isn't just about politics," she said. "This is about the very reason your funding applications were denied. This is about why your pitch decks got no response. Because people like you, without political connections, without expensive lobbyists, were never meant to be on the short list." That's what Representative Crockett put on the record today. And that's why this bill matters. In Detroit, Cleveland, El Paso, and Oakland, chambers of commerce that had previously remained apolitical posted formal letters in support of the bill's key provisions, specifically the requirement for independent, multi-person grant review panels and transparent, real-time reporting of who receives federal funds and why. The message was clear. Accountability was no longer optional. A storm had passed through Washington, and it had cleared the air. But the response wasn't just reactive. It was personal. Dozens of small business owners, many of them from underserved communities, flooded Crockett's office email with testimonies. Some were emotional, others enraged. One email, later read aloud on CNN Tonight, came from a bakery owner in Tulsa who had applied for SBA funding 3 times and been denied each time. "I did everything right," it read. "I went to every workshop. I filled out every form. I took a loan against my own home to qualify. And still, I got nothing. But today I saw someone say out loud what we've all known in silence, that the game is rigged, that we weren't just unlucky, we were unseen. Thank you for dragging this into the light." Crockett's office, overwhelmed but resolute, released a short statement that evening. "This isn't the end. This is the beginning of accountability. We will not stop until equity is no longer a loophole, but the law." Even on Wall Street, where federal grants are often treated as a distant whisper, market analysts took note. Bloomberg News ran a feature under the headline, "Small Business Reform from Committee Room to Boardroom." In it, several venture capitalists acknowledged that public trust in federal grant processes had been deteriorating for years, but that the clarity, structure, and enforceable equity requirements outlined in Crockett's bill might finally bring a new level of legitimacy. "We've watched Black and brown entrepreneurs pitch the same ideas, stronger sometimes, and walk away empty-handed," said Maurice Lattimore, managing partner at Apex Equity Group. "If this legislation passes, that playing field starts to level. That's not just good policy, that's good economics. But perhaps the most dramatic sign that Crockett's performance had broken through the noise came not from political figures or business leaders, but from ordinary Americans. TikTok videos with voiceovers of Crockett's calm but relentless questioning exploded in popularity, some garnering millions of views in under 24 hours. One post, set to a slow-motion replay of Crockett reading McMahon's email, "We need some fast wins with this group," ended with a simple caption, "You just watched corruption get cross-examined live." It was raw, it was unapologetic, and it was exactly the kind of viral justice many felt had been missing for far too long. Even political cynics took notice. Columnist Andrew Callahan, known for his biting skepticism of congressional performance, wrote in Rolling Stone, "Jasmine Crockett just did something that rarely happens in Washington. She changed the conversation, not with slogans, with documents, with receipts, with restraint, and with fury that never once lost its dignity." At a time when hearings are often dismissed as hollow theater, where cameras roll but accountability rarely follows, this was different. There was weight in Crockett's pauses, precision in her tone, and when she pivoted from confrontation to solution, it wasn't to save face, it was to finish the job. Because while Linda McMahon's silence in that room had been deafening, it was Jasmine Crockett's clarity that echoed, not just through the halls of the Capitol, but through every place where truth had been waiting for someone to finally call it by name. And as the public pressure swelled and the air around the Capitol seemed to thrum with the weight of consequence, Jasmine Crockett moved swiftly, not to celebrate, but to legislate. Her next step came not with spectacle, but with strategy, the formal introduction of the Small Business Equity Act into the halls of Congress. It was a move timed with surgical precision, born not out of vengeance, but necessity. And this time, she wasn't walking into a hearing to confront a figurehead. She was stepping into the legislative arena to dismantle the very scaffolding that allowed corruption to hide in plain sight. The bill was clear, unflinching, and sharp as a blade. It proposed an overhaul of the federal small business grant system from top to bottom, mandatory independent review panels, full transparency in applicant tracking, real-time publication of fund recipients, and a strict ban on political affiliation or contribution history being considered in funding decisions. No backroom phone calls, no whispered promises, no more special lanes for the connected. Crockett's language was as plain as it was powerful. Access to opportunity should not be reserved for those who know someone in the room. It should be the right of those who've built something from nothing. And the shock came not from the Democratic side. It came from the silence that followed on the Republican benches. Silence, and then something else, murmurs of agreement. Within 48 hours, the Small Business Equity Act was co-sponsored by a bipartisan coalition that caught even seasoned analysts off guard. Republican Representative John Curtis of Utah issued a public statement that read, "This is not a partisan matter. This is a procedural failure that affects the backbone of our economy. Honest entrepreneurs." The bill's emphasis on fairness and transparency is something all Americans can support. And he wasn't alone. Moderate Republicans in swing districts, sensing the overwhelming public approval and media momentum, added their names to the legislation, some out of conviction, others out of political survival. But the effect was the same. The bill gained muscle. In a stunning display of rare unity, the House Committee on Small Business scheduled an emergency session to prioritize the bill's markup. What followed was not debate, it was acceleration. From committee rooms to press briefings, Crockett's name echoed like a warning bell to lobbyists and old guard operatives who had long profited from invisible loopholes and inaccessible power. This wasn't just policy anymore. It was momentum, and the people who had laughed off the hearing as another piece of political theater were suddenly reading every line of the bill with furrowed brows. Meanwhile, outside the marble walls of Washington, the real shift was happening on the streets, in storefronts, in co-working spaces, in warehouses and cafes, in the corners of the country that power forgets. The National Coalition of Independent Entrepreneurs, a once-splintered alliance of over 3,000 small business associations, issued its first unanimous resolution in years, full and immediate endorsement of the Small Business Equity Act. Their statement didn't mince words. For too long, the system has spoken with a whisper to the privileged and a wall of silence to the rest of us. We stand with Representative Crockett not because she spoke truth, but because she gave it teeth. In Los Angeles, a Latina-owned manufacturing startup called VegaCore posted a viral video explaining how they had been denied funding for 3 years, only to discover that a nearby company with fewer employees and weaker revenue metrics had received priority placement, later traced to a political donor. "We followed every rule," the CEO said through tears, "but they had one thing we didn't, a name on a check. This bill, this is for people like us." And in North Carolina, the Southern Black Founders Alliance held a town hall streamed by nearly 200,000 viewers. Speaker after speaker, from bootstrapped barbershop owners to first-generation tech founders, shared the same story in different words. The door had always been cracked open for a select few. Now Crockett was kicking it off its hinges. "This isn't about handouts," one woman shouted to applause. "This is about taking the thumb off the scale." Even organizations typically wary of federal oversight, like the Liberty Chamber of Independent Business, stunned their base by releasing a cautiously supportive brief. "While we remain concerned about government overreach, we believe this legislation increases accountability while preserving entrepreneurial freedom. It is targeted, enforceable, and overdue." The change in tone across the business community was impossible to ignore. Journalists covering the Capitol began to note that Crockett was no longer being referred to simply as a rising star, but as a force of correction. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline that stunned longtime readers: "Crockett's bill sparks realignment in small business politics." Even former skeptics like columnist Neil Patterson wrote, "I was prepared to dismiss her as another firebrand with a microphone. But then I read the bill. It's not fire, it's a blueprint." Inside Congress, the pressure mounted. Lobbying firms scrambled to find ways to either support or quietly neutralize the bill. But Crockett had already anticipated the maneuvering. She had built the language tightly, with clauses designed to make exemptions nearly impossible without public record and multi-agency review. Every line had been forged in the same fire that exposed Linda McMahon: precision, persistence, and principle. As the legislative calendar moved toward the floor vote, a rare sight emerged in the Capitol. Citizens lining the marble hallways not to protest, but to support. Small business owners flew in from across the country, some sleeping on airport benches to afford the trip, just to show that the bill mattered. They brought placards not with slogans, but stories: loan rejection letters, grant application summaries, tax filings. Evidence of what they had built and what had been denied them. Crockett, never one for grandstanding, stood quietly among them in the hallway outside the chamber, thanking each person by name. She didn't speak to the cameras that day. She didn't need to. Her work was already echoing across the country like a thunderclap. Because this time, justice wasn't just being spoken, it was being written into law. And while the momentum of the legislation surged forward, sweeping across Capitol Hill with a righteous fury, Linda McMahon's world was shrinking, fast and mercilessly. The same media networks that once praised her as a visionary entrepreneur now dissected every line of her testimony with surgical cruelty. Her once prized image, the iron-willed businesswoman who had conquered both the private sector and public office, had become an emblem of elitism, favoritism, and institutional rot. In less than 72 hours, her name had fallen from invitations, been stripped from marketing decks, and quietly erased from speaker rosters she once dominated. The decline wasn't loud, it was surgical. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls returned with clipped, rehearsed rejections. Her scheduled keynote at the Conservative Women's Leadership Forum was postponed indefinitely, a polite euphemism no one believed. Behind closed doors, those who had once touted her as a model of American enterprise were now whispering about reputational risk. One think tank director was overheard telling staff, "We can't have her associated with us while that video is still circulating. We'd be inviting a riot into the comment section." In her Connecticut estate, the silence was deafening. No camera crews, no calls from cable producers, just the muted tap of PR consultants advising her to Go quiet for now. She declined all interviews, all rebuttals, all attempted salvaging. Not because she was cornered, but because somewhere beneath the layers of curated authority, she had begun to understand. This wasn't a political loss. This was a legacy in freefall. The institutions she helped shape, the business groups, the conservative foundations, the executive boards, began to drift away like ships pulling anchor. Board members from one economic policy council she co-founded held an emergency vote. She was quietly asked to resign. No formal press release, no thanks for her service. Just a line in a Monday memo, board composition updated, effective immediately. And then came the withdrawal, not just by organizations, but by people. Former allies, co-hosts, donors, strategists. Even those who had once benefited from her political patronage now avoided eye contact at luncheons and retreats. At a closed-door donor gala in Palm Beach, she entered a room and the conversation thinned to near nothing. A few nodded stiffly. No one invited her to sit. The chill was undeniable, and the commentary didn't stop at politics. Journalists began digging into the internal practices of her tenure at the Small Business Administration with renewed vigor. Articles from left, center, and right began connecting dots between previously ignored anomalies, funding anomalies, contract accelerations, advisory hires. The Crockett hearing was a match dropped on a powder trail, wrote one investigative columnist in The Atlantic, and McMahon lit that trail herself years ago with every unchecked exception and privilege pass. The op-eds were relentless. The end of the McMahon myth, one declared. From wrestling rings to public shame, said another. Even her defenders couldn't find footing. One loyal commentator on a business news channel tried to pivot, suggesting the backlash was just another chapter in cancel culture. The clip flopped. Twitter called it the worst spin since Enron. And then came the shift from critique to consequence. Two small business owners, both denied grants during her tenure, filed a joint lawsuit citing arbitrary and biased practices that violated federal guidelines. Their evidence? Internal memos surfaced through FOIA requests that revealed irregular review patterns eerily similar to what Crockett had exposed. The plaintiffs didn't just want compensation, they wanted structural change. The suit's impact was immediate. Public sympathy swelled around the entrepreneurs. National legal networks offered pro bono counsel. And McMahon, though not formally charged, was suddenly the face of a class action movement she could no longer control. But perhaps the most crushing blow came from a source no one expected: Vince McMahon himself. In a statement released through World Wrestling Entertainment's legal team, the company declared that Linda McMahon's past governmental decisions do not reflect the values or business practices of WWE. A clean-cut, public, brutal. For decades, the McMahon name had been synonymous with dominance, inside the ring and out. But now even her family's empire was stepping back, walling off her liability like a quarantine contagion. And still she said nothing. No press conference, no apology tour, no ghost-written op-ed. Only once at a quiet charity fundraiser weeks later did she speak briefly. "I thought I was helping," she told a small circle of attendees. Her voice cracked on the last word. "But maybe I was only helping the people who already had everything." The room fell silent. No applause followed. Some called it too little, too late. Others said it was the first honest thing she had uttered in years. But no matter how you parsed it, the era of Linda McMahon was over. She withdrew from public boards. She turned down offers to appear on business panels. Her social media presence, once curated by a small team of strategists and image makers, went dark. The last post, dated just days before the hearing, was a smiling photo with the caption, "Proud to support small business across this great nation." No comments remained. Her inner circle, now whittled to a handful of loyalists, tried to shield her. But the damage wasn't reputational alone. It was personal. In the months that followed, she began spending most of her time outside Washington. No more fundraisers, no more panels, no more headlines. Just silence. And the humbling realization that influence, once broken, rarely mends the same way. The woman who once stood at the pinnacle of American entrepreneurship, a titan who parlayed wrestling empire success into the corridors of national power, had been undone, not by scandal alone, but by exposure, by the cold light of truth, wielded without rage, without spectacle, but with precision. And in the end, that was the irony that stung the most. She hadn't been taken down by smear campaigns or partisan war. She had been taken down by facts. And yet, from the wreckage of exposed corruption and reputational collapse, something unexpected began to rise. Not shame, not vengeance, but reform. While Linda McMahon receded from the public eye and the political world recalibrated in the aftermath, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had not paused. She did not celebrate. She did not grandstand. She returned to her district, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. For her, the hearing was never about spectacle. It was about justice. And justice, she believed, must be proven not in headlines, but in the lives of people who had been denied a seat at the table for far too long. 1 year to the day after that unforgettable hearing, the effects of the Small Business Equity Act had rippled outward like a tide, finally reaching the shores it was meant for. The numbers didn't just tell a story, they told a revolution. In her district alone, over $15 million in federal small business funding had been allocated directly to underserved neighborhoods. That figure wasn't just impressive, it was seismic. The previous year, that same district had received just under $3 million. Now, thanks to the oversight mandates, equity scoring systems, and independent grant review panels mandated by Crockett's legislation, the money was flowing where it had always been promised, but never truly arrived. Into the hands of those who built their dreams, one brick, $1, one sleepless night at a time. It wasn't just numbers, it was faces, stories, lives. In South Dallas, a Black-owned tech startup that had been denied 3 years in a row due to insufficient scalability now had a fully staffed office and had just hired its 12th employee. The founder, a former teacher named Calvin Miles, had tears in his eyes when he told a local reporter, "They used to tell us, you don't qualify. Now, we're building apps that help kids learn math in the very schools that forgot about us. That's because of her. That's because of Jasmine Crockett." In Oak Cliff, a Latina mother of 3 named Maria Delgado had opened a community bakery, Pan y Alma, Bread and Soul, using a grant she never thought she'd see. "They used to say, 'You're not what we're looking for,'" she said during a televised town hall. "Now my daughter helps me run the register after school. My son bakes with me in the mornings. I'm not just a small business. I'm the center of something, a change." Across the state, from Houston's Fifth Ward to El Paso's border communities, entrepreneurs who had long been invisible to federal programs were now being heard, funded, and supported. And it was not an accident. It was policy. It was architecture. It was the result of Crockett walking into the lion's den, confronting a titan of privilege and exposure, and rewriting the rules with the same fire she had once used to survive. But what made this transformation even more powerful was its moral symmetry. Where McMahon had once funneled taxpayer dollars toward political allies and legacy corporations, Crockett's reform bill had removed the dark corridors of influence. Under the new mandates, grant recipients were anonymized during the first round of reviews. Applications were scored on community impact, fiscal transparency, and innovation, not donor history or insider relationships. Reviewers, now bound by rotating blind panels, had no knowledge of race, political alignment, or background wealth. The system was no longer tilted, it was reset. And the results? They were immediate. More than 400 minority-owned businesses across the United States had received their first ever federal support. A historic number of applications had come from rural indigenous communities. In Alabama, a women-led construction cooperative on tribal land was finally able to launch a training program for young apprentices. In Detroit, a group of formerly incarcerated men opened a mechanic school that combined hands-on learning with literacy and reintegration services. The ripple effects were beyond economic. They were generational. And the people noticed. Media outlets that had once covered the hearing as political theater were now forced to return, this time to report on its consequences. The Crockett reform, 1 year later, became a primetime special on PBS. CNN aired a feature titled "From Shadow to Spotlight: How One Bill Changed the Face of Small Business in America." Even skeptics from the business world began to acknowledge what they could no longer deny. The old system hadn't just failed, it had excluded. And now finally the floodgates had opened. Crockett didn't bask in this. In fact, she barely acknowledged the attention. Her focus remained fixed on implementation, oversight, and future phases of the reform. When she returned to Washington for a press briefing marking the one-year anniversary, she walked to the podium in the exact same blazer she wore at the McMahon hearing. It was intentional, and her words were clear. "This is not about revenge," she said, her voice firm but measured. "This is about restoration. This is about the father who got a second chance after a felony, the immigrant family that turned a food cart into a restaurant, the girl who now believes she doesn't have to inherit poverty but can inherit pride. This is the work, and I'm not done." That statement echoed across newsrooms and community halls alike. But perhaps the most powerful recognition didn't come from headlines or government websites. It came from within the communities themselves. In the heart of West Dallas, a mural had been painted across the side